a continuing step in our conversation and dialogue. And I want to be responsive to all of you in the way you think about these issues as you're elected alderman. The last few months have been very difficult for all of us. And I think that the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others around the country at the hands of police officers have highlighted a critical issue that has been ongoing and happened far too often, which is the deaths of African Americans and Hispanics to white police officers around the country. In Chicago, we've had situations with the homicide of Laquan McDonald and the deaths of Quintonio Laguerre, Betty Jones, and many others. Histories of torture with John Burge, and our city's history of racism and abuse with the police department. These are not new issues to Chicago, and issues that we have to grapple with and deal with to make sure that our city is one that is equal and equitable and one that is safe for everyone. And from a policing perspective and a safety perspective, ensuring that every resident of Chicago gets fairness under the law. And that's a system that I want to make sure is in place so that Blacks and Hispanics are not targeted, harassed, or killed by police officers, and one that will bring safety to the city, where as we start this 4th of July weekend, and we've had significant violence across the city the last couple weeks, police accountability and safety in communities is built on trust. And to me, they're very dependent and equal. If people don't trust the police, they're not going to call when they need it. And violence that we see across the city of Chicago will continue. And I think for us to have a system where the community has a voice in how policing happens and how safety is implemented across the city of Chicago is critical. For the 9 years I've been alderman here, I've really worked to build a community where there's been partnership with community residents, community organizations, and the police, with the addition of adding to social services, programs for young people like BAM, Edgewater Kids United, many other programs. But that has added safety in our community. But the safety that we see has not been felt across the city of Chicago. And until it is felt in every single community in our city, specifically on the south and west side, we have a long way to go for overall safety. This time has also been a time of reflection and action. I think all of you that have been very active in protests and calling for change, I support that and I appreciate that. Many of you came to my office this time last week to kind of voice your strong voice for the call of change. And again, I appreciate that. I've gotten your emails and heard loudly from you, and I'm sure I'm going to hear it from you tonight. I've been fortunate in representing our community that regardless of the issues, the constituents of the 48th Ward are very vocal about what they want. And I think I've tried to be very responsive as the alderman to make sure that we're listening to that. The issues of police reform in Chicago, I think, go back a number of years, specifically from the homicide of Laquan McDonald. And from his death, there have been the Justice Department reports, the Police Accountability Task Force report and findings, ultimately a federal consent decree, which I will talk about a little bit later, and reforms within the police department, which call for increased training, de-escalation, use of body-worn cameras, more crisis intervention training so that people that need social work or other things besides the police, that is dealt with, and the police are dealing with that in a more holistic way. Those are steps that are going to continue to be ongoing. In addition, as part of the reform measures, we have the police FOP contract that is currently being negotiated by the city. Earlier this week, there was a arbitration finding related to 3 of the contracts for supervisory personnel, where there were reforms that the mayor and the city council had asked for specifically related to anonymous complaints and not allowing for people to have an anonymous complaint, as well as using past personnel information in evaluations on cases, but also to not destroy past performance measures. Those are things that we are critical because the police contract is a vital part of this. The overall police contract is being negotiated, and that's going to be something that will continue. But specifically beyond that, I think the city has, based on all of these reforms, been trying to come up with a system that will create civilian oversight. That's something that has been heard in all of the findings that we've heard previously. That's something that I think there's uniformity on in many parts of the city. As a member of the city council, I sat on hearings that went around the city. Some of you may have been at Amundsen High School, where we heard about people and the need for civilian oversight. Why is civilian oversight so important? Currently, the police department is run by police employees, and whether it's policy making, whether it's direction and goals, whether it's the on-the-ground operations, that is not informed by the residents in the city of Chicago. And for us to ultimately have a police system in place that provides safety, it's critical that we have civilian oversight and a strong community voice that helps guide policing in Chicago. Until we have that, we're going to continue to have a lack of trust. And I think the lack of trust manifests itself in many, many ways. It manifests itself by people feeling like they are targeted. It manifests itself by people not feeling comfortable in calling the police because they're unsure of what the outcomes will be, or if they will be wrapped up in the criminality. And we see, when we see the violence in the South and West Sides, and talking to residents who live there and elected officials and community organizers who are there, that's part of some of the violence issues that we're dealing with, is that there's that lack of trust. So having civilian oversight is a critical measure in that. Currently before the city council, there are two ordinances, and I'm going to give a little bit of a high level on both, and get into specifics of why I support one and not the other, and then kind of talk more about process moving forward. So over the last 3 years, I've been one of the lead co-sponsors on an ordinance called the GAPA ordinance. And what it does is create a community commission on public safety and accountability, a 9-person civilian oversight board that would be appointed to basically nominate individuals to the mayor to be the superintendent of police, the COPA chief, Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and the police board. These individuals would be nominated to the mayor and ratified by the city council from a process that would come from the grassroots. One part of the GAPA ordinance is each police district in the city of Chicago would elect 3 members, and those members would have different roles. One of them would be on the local level to work with the police commander and residents in the community to basically foster community policing solutions to make the neighborhood safe. And that's to hear from community residents about safety concerns that they have, come up with proactive ways to add safety, and that could be through adding programming, it could be creating events, it could be talking to people about safety issues that they have, and finding ways where the community can come more in contact and partnership with local police officers. And we've tried to do some of that stuff in our summer times in the past when we have not had COVID, to engage in constructive, positive ways with the police and young people in our community and other all residents to address safety issues. But these 3 elected members would have that role on an annual basis. One of those members would sit on a citywide group that would basically nominate people to the citywide commission. And the members on this commission would come from a diverse background. The ordinance right now has 9 members, 2 of which are young. I think it's been very important to hear the voice of young people. So 2 of these members would be from 18 to 24. Other members would have to have backgrounds in civil rights. So the goal is to try to have people that represent a very diverse background in Chicago that can really help get to what is being heard on the ground. In addition to nominating members to the mayor for superintendent of police, COPA chief, and police board, one of the key aspects is that this commission would have final say on policy. And policy is critical in everything that the police department does. Everything that happens right now at CPD comes from policy, whether it's the shirts that people wear, whether it's use of force or body-worn cameras, all of it's policy driven. Having a civilian group that basically would have oversight and final say on policy helps guide the direction of CPD. And I think that that's critical. And I think many people that have worked on this issue for a number of years feel that that's very, very important. I think the goal in this is that there would be collaboration, because there are technical aspects of policy that CPD has. They have a team that works on policy throughout the year. But having final say, where a commission of civilians would have say on policy, we believe is a critical aspect to have community voice on that, on policy moving forward for the city of Chicago. We also believe that this would help enact trust in what those policies are. Additionally, there'd be a budget for this commission and staff for this commission to be able to research issues. The other key aspect is that they would be able to work on annual goals and evaluations and basically an assessment of the superintendent of police, the chief of COPA, and the police board. This is also critical because a lot of times we don't know what those goals are. I think a lot of us in Chicago, and me as an elected official, we see the day-to-day efforts by the police department and these other entities that are trying to improve safety in our city, but we never sit down and say, what are the ultimate goals? I think this gives the commission the ability to help put those goals in place and hold the superintendent of police and the others accountable to that, and then have it be informed by residents of the city of Chicago. I think understanding what the plan is, understanding what the goals are, and having the community weigh in on that, I think is critical. So those are some of the key aspects of that. I think some on-the-ground examples of how that would work if it was in place now. The commission would be, if it was in place now, have the ability to review the police action that occurred during the unrest in Chicago over the last month, where the protests are. The commission, if in place, would have the ability to bring people together to discuss that, review that issue, and talk about what happened. That's a key aspect that I think they would have the ability to empower to bring people together and provide testimony about what happens, and do so in a very open and transparent way. And the transparency is a key part of that. The other is the use of force policy. Last year, the city of Chicago, the police department changed the use of force policy, and that was done internally, drafted by the police department. And then once it was drafted, it was put out for comment for 30 days to the public. And whatever public comment was taken in, I believe there was some that was incorporated or not, but it was very police driven and not community driven. I think that having the community commission have oversight on policy would create a much more open and transparent policy making system where people could be heard throughout the policy making process. I think that's a key aspect of that would be different than there is today. All of these efforts, we think, provide for more trust with Chicago residents and the police accountability system, because one, there's a local elected component on the ground at the district council level that would be there day to day, working in communities, understanding what the issues are, but also a citywide oversight entity that would be looking at the bigger issues and holding the key stakeholders accountable in how policing and the accountability system in Chicago works. The other key aspect of this is that the day-to-day functions of the police department and the day-to-day functions of COPA and the police board would run as they are. I think that that's one aspect where it's important that these entities are basically getting direction, but are able to manage, and the day-to-day management or oversight of that is not, the day-to-day administration of that is not overseen, on a day-to-day basis. I think that's a key aspect. As we know from the violence in Chicago, and the superintendent of police and his leadership team has to have a system in place where they're trying to prevent crime. So I think that's an important aspect, that those entities would be able to do that and work on it. There's a lot of common ground on this. On the GAPA ordinance, I will tell you that there are 30 co-sponsors that represent a broad, diverse cross-section of the city of Chicago as far as elected officials. Many of them, the lead sponsor is Rod Sawyer, who's the alderman of the 6th Ward on the south side. But this has support from aldermen from all parts of the city, including many African-American and Latino aldermen. The other ordinance that many of you have written to me about is the CPAC ordinance. And the key difference, it's kind of a fundamental difference, is that the members would be elected of this commission, and they would have control of appointing the superintendent of police and the leadership of those other entities. They would also have the ability to negotiate the police contract, as well as the budget for the city, the budget for the police department, and also be able to reassign police districts so that they would be able to shift that. Some of the other local not concerns, I'll get into my concerns in a minute, but basically this would also then, those individuals that would be elected would also have, in addition to their oversight ability and power, they would also have investigatory power on a local level. So they would basically be an oversight person, but they would also have functional, on-the-ground investigative powers and other subpoena powers at the local level in each police district of the city of Chicago. I have raised some concerns in my recent newsletter last week, and I'll kind of walk through them and answer more questions later about my concerns of this. And they come in what I will call our twofold areas. One is a more fundamental, high-level approach across the city, which is that I believe that the mayor of the city of Chicago has to have the ability to appoint the superintendent of police. I think that regardless of who the mayor is, I think the appointment of the superintendent of police is the most important appointment that the mayor will make. And I think that picking someone that has the same vision to try to create a system that will add safety in every community in the city of Chicago is critical to every mayor. The other part of it is if the mayor does not have that ability, there is a lack of accountability for that elected mayor. So that this coming Monday morning, if there is violence in Chicago, the mayor of the city of Chicago would be able to say, well, that's not my responsibility. And I don't think that anyone wants that. I think all of us have a collective responsibility when it comes to safety. But I think with the appointment of the superintendent of police, I think critically that the mayor of the city of Chicago, regardless of who the mayor is, should have that ability. The other aspect relates to the ability to negotiate a police contract. Having an 11-person group that was elected to have sole responsibility for negotiating a police contract, I think is something that from a financial fiduciary requirement for Chicago, I think that's very concerning. I think under the current system, there are checks and balances with city council approval. The supervisory contract that I mentioned has to get passed by the city council. That's something that we will be doing in July. Having one entity have that sole responsibility may sound like a good idea, but the outcome of those contracts, we don't know. I think there are reforms that we would like to see in the FOP contract that have been highlighted. That's something that the city is working on. But having 11 people be able to basically negotiate a police contract without any kind of checks and balances, I think for me personally, as an elected alderman, is concerning. Also with the police budget, I think having the system where we basically are reviewing the police budget. Many of you have reached out about defunding the police. And I think that we look at the police budget on an ongoing basis, and it is a significant part of the city's budget. But having those checks and balances where the, I think, is being reviewed throughout the budget process, I think having that go to 11 people is uncertain, because we don't know if the budget would be cut in half. We don't know if the budget would be tripled in size. And from a taxpayer perspective, I think that's something that all of us should be concerned about as we move forward. The other question I'll just raise is, I think that with the elected component, many of us envision people that would be elected like us in our community. And I think regardless of our viewpoint on things, I think many of us want the same things. In an election process, and I point you no further than the current White House situation, elections are uncertain. And I think that putting all the power with 11 people, what's going to happen with that system is that a lot of other special interests are going to get significantly involved to drop a lot of money on that race. It will not be a race where it's a local race. It's going to be one that a lot of special interests would get significantly involved in. My other concerns are on a very local level, and it relates to, I believe that the system of accountability has to be administered fairly across the city of Chicago. Whether you live in Edgewater or in Woodlawn, if there's police misconduct or excessive abuse, those need to be investigated by trained professionals, and the outcomes of those investigations need to be transparent and just, so that all of us across the city can see how that is implemented, because trust is the core of the accountability system. One of the concerns I have on a local level is that each of these elected district members would have the ability to also investigate police misconduct and police-involved violence. And I think that as an elected official myself who's got a staff, I believe that that's best suited, not for an elected individual, but for someone who's trained and knows how to investigate those very difficult shootings or excessive abuse cases where it happens in the middle of the night, and having an elected individual go out there and try to investigate that, I think, is concerning to me. I would much rather have trained professionals go out and do that and have them supervise and have their outcomes be transparent to all in the city of Chicago. The other concern I have related to this is that if those individuals elected at a district level have that investigative power, the chance that there can be different administration of justice from district to district, north side to south side to west side, to me is very concerning. I would not want someone who is elected in one part of the city to treat misconduct one way instead of treating it another way. I think it's critical that our accountability system, excuse my dog, our accountability system across the city of Chicago is uniform, and that it is rigorous, and that there are outcomes where everyone can see how it works, and they don't have to worry if they're going from one district to the next, how they will be treated if something bad happens to them. So I think from a local level, I want to make sure that there's uniformity across the city. I will say this, and I think it also relates, I want to say this real quick point, and then we'll keep going. The uniformity part, I think, is critical, because if we create a system that doesn't work, and I say this because some of the people that are supporting the CPAC ordinance have said, well, what do we have to lose? The system in place it's there now is not working. Let's just try something different. I think we have one chance to do this. And I think we have not gotten into the city, our situation in Chicago overnight. And it's going to take us a significant amount of time to get out of it. But if we create a system that is flawed, and a system that there are gaps in how things would be administered, I think what that will do is undercut trust, and it will put us back further than we are today. The beliefs I have on this are not just my own. They are informed by other elected officials who've looked at both ordinances for many years. I keep an open mind, and I want to say that, because I want to talk next about kind of process moving forward. I think one thing that I will tell you, and I want to say that tonight I want to hear from you, and I want you to be candid with me about your thoughts on it, but I wanted to articulate my concerns and know that we may have a difference of opinion, but it's not based on the call for change, because I deeply believe that there is a need for a call for change. And I think all of you do as well. It's what's the system that we put in place and how it will be administered to make our city safer and make it more just and more fair. There have been recent conversations between the leadership of GAPA and CPAC. And I will tell you that as someone who has been involved in this for 3 years, that has not always happened. And I think that I'm very encouraged by that the leadership of both groups are beginning to talk. I would expect that moving forward, there will not be a vote on this matter in July. I think that August or September is more likely. So there will be time to continue to talk about all that's gone on. I also want to share with you, a sense of urgency. I understand the urgency that we need in Chicago and what we need across the country. The issues that we're dealing with in Chicago is being looked at in Illinois, being looked at the federal level, but I understand the sense of urgency. We can't wait on this, but it's critical that we get it right. So I think there are conversations that are going. I think that we will continue the dialogue like we're having here today. And I'm also talking to my colleagues on the South and West Side. I think where there is a higher level of violence that we see in our community, where there is a call for more police and making sure that the police are doing the right things. And I think that's the key thing, is that the policing is done well, and it's not something that is targeting people or sweeping people off of corners, but it's someone that's working to problem solve and try to create a better system. I am supportive of trying to add more social workers in communities to help deal with some of the issues like mental illness or substance abuse that sometimes get caught up in the legal system. So those are some things that I'm focused on and open to. Others have also brought up the issue related to police in schools. Today we had a hearing over 4 hours about that issue. That's something that I'm open to, having police out of schools, but I want to do it phased over this year so that we're not having students in schools be unsafe, but trying to add more social workers, more programs like BAM that have worked at Senn and Gowdy and Swift. Having those programs that support students in a safe way, I think is something that we should do, and that money would be better spent. So that's something definitely that I am supportive of. I will tell you that there are also legal issues related to this and as how we move forward. I think that there are legal briefs done by both the GAPA representatives and CPAC about the legality of issues. I think the one thing I will tell you is that on the legal side, there's concern about the constitutionality of the CPAC ordinance as it is written. I think my understanding is because we are creating new powers under that ordinance to appoint superintendent of police and budgetary authority, that action would have to be taken on a citywide referendum, or state law would have to be passed. So it's not just as simple as passing a city ordinance and getting 26 votes for it to become a law. The other part of that is that on the GAPA side, because of the electoral process of that, we need a supermajority of 34 votes to get it passed. So that's something that while we have 30 co-sponsors, we're working to get additional co-sponsors to pass it. So I am not a lawyer, and I don't want to get into the over legal issues between the two. I think a lot of my concerns are more fundamental. I'll leave the legal issues aside, but I also wanted to say that there are legal issues related to that. And I think those are issues that are real and people have to take into consideration. The last thing I'll say is that just kind of moving forward, and then I'm going to go into some of the questions that were pre-asked, and then we're going to kind of throw it open to have all of you ask questions, is I want to try to use the rest of this summer in an urgent way to continue our dialogue and hear from you. And tonight's part of that. We're going to be meeting in our office out on community corners on Tuesdays and Thursdays around the city of Chicago safely and distance-wise. But we'll be out there talking to you Additionally, I'm talking to many residents in the community that have reached out to me about these issues. As we move into the fall, though, I think I'm going to broaden the conversation beyond police accountability and try to have a community conversation about what safety means in our neighborhood. I think we've worked together for many years to add safety in our community, but if people aren't feeling safe in our community or want to see safety done in a different way, or they're not feeling that they're part of the safety that's in our neighborhood, that's concerning to me. So I think trying to have youth voices, trying to have voices of African American, Hispanic residents of our community about what safety means for them locally, I think that's critical and something that I'm going to try to foster a conversation so that as a community, we can talk about what safety means to us. And it goes beyond crime statistics. It's about how we feel in our neighborhood. So I think that's something that will be another outcome of our conversation. So I have talked a lot. I'm going to start reading some questions. I'm going to read a handful of them off, and then Allie Brisbane is going to moderate the Q&A. I think if you have a question, I would encourage you to raise your hand, which you have a function of, and Allie will call on you, and I'll do the best to answer your questions, and then we'll see how things go. So. First question, you stated that CPAC puts power in 11 hands. Isn't that preferable to putting power in one person's hands when the unchecked power mayoral office has repeatedly failed? It is not held accountable. I think, as I stated before, the system that we have with civilian oversight, if we had the GAPA ordinance in place, there would be a commission that would have a significant amount of say and oversight in policing in Chicago. I think that the checks and balances with the mayor, I think, are there. And I think, again, I would say that it's important that the mayor has some accountability in policing and safety in Chicago. And I think all of us who live here would hope for that. Will you explicitly in detail explain your fears behind supporting CPAC? What specifically do you think will happen if CPAC goes through instead of GAPA? I think I laid some of the concerns out about the ability for 11-person commission to have oversight over appointing the superintendent of police, budgeting, contract authority, as well as the local administration of investigation of crimes and wrongdoing. I think that that's better done by COPA, where they would have trained investigators that would do that, and the findings would be done in a very open and transparent way. What mechanisms in your supported approaches ensure the police misconduct will result in actual consequences, removal of officers, serious disciplinary actions, and accountability for improper policing that are different from the past? How will racial profiling, over-policing of Blacks, people of color, lack of respect for Blacks and people of color, use of force as a primary force be first response in those situations? How will you guarantee real change for once? I think what I'd go back to is that I think real change is going to be comprehensive. And I think I've outlined earlier some of the reforms that we've taken in Chicago since the murder of Laquan McDonald. The key thing that is very important for everyone on the call to understand is that the police department is currently under a federally mandated consent decree. And the consent decree is a federal monitor who is basically her and her team overseeing all of the reforms that are mandated legally by the Chicago Police Department. Those reforms came about because of a court-ordered consent decree and are vast and numerous. For the city of Chicago to not be under a federal consent decree, we will have to have met all of those reforms. Regardless of the ordinances that we're discussing tonight, the federal consent decree is going to drive policing in Chicago and drive the improvement of policing in Chicago for the next 5 to 10 years. And like other cities like Baltimore, Los Angeles, and many others that have gone through this process, it is a long, important process that, if done well and embraced by the leadership of CPD and city elected officials, will help make our system better than it has been before. And legally, we will not be able to end the consent decree until those reforms are met. having these ordinances for civilian oversight and the other reforms that are in place all link up together. So I think that I look at this as a comprehensive way. Next Tuesday, we will have a city council meeting regarding the consent decree. And I think that my staff can email out the full consent decree, and it's hundreds of pages long with many things that have to be met. CPD currently has been behind. I think a report came out 10 days ago from the Monitor that said that we were behind in 70% of that, and that's totally unacceptable. So I think the City Council and the Public Safety Committee are going to do more to make sure that that's being met, because those reforms are going to really help improve policing. But I think all of those, coupled with civilian oversight, to me, are going to lead change. And I think, how do we measure change? I think it's going to be measured in lots of ways. But I think ultimately it's going to measure how people feel on the ground in every community in the city of Chicago. Are the police a partner with them, or are the police trying to target them unjustly? And I think that's something that's going to take time, but I believe that we are on the right path. You talk about the consent decree in your support to GAPRA. How come compliance has been lagging? I think I just kind of mentioned that. I rarely see police officers in the neighborhood other than driving by in car. Are there plans to find ways to have police officers possibly walking a beat, or bike officers, to create more interaction in a face-to-face measure? I think one of the things that we've done over the last 8 to 9 years is we've added foot patrolmen in our community. At Thorndale, at Bryn Mawr, Argyle, on Clark Street, areas where we've had high crime in the past, we've had foot patrolmen. And those foot patrolmen are important because they are on the ground, I think, developing relationships and understanding kind of what's going on with the people that are in those areas. They're not there to lock people up, they're there to problem solve. And I think one of the key things that we've done by having foot patrolmen has really helped make sure that policing and safety are improved in those areas. And I think that's been one of the major drivers to the reduction in crime in our community, in addition to the other programs like BAM and others that we've started. I think bike patrols and other things like that are things that we want to expand. I think one thing that I've had frustrations with is that the CAPS system that was initiated 25 years ago is a shell of what it used to be. And that creates a lot of frustration. I think with the GAPA ordinance and the 3 district members in the districts working on community policing, I think there's a far greater chance for more community involvement and a more better process when that happens. So I think those are some of the things that we want to focus on. You argue that the proposed CPAC council would not have checks and balances, insinuating that there are levers in place in the current model or the GAPA proposal. When the mayor called the curfew to have protesters downtown so the police could brutalize and terrorize our people, what checks and balances were used to combat the disgusting approach? When the mayor shut down the CTA, what checks did they use? So I think there have been significant amount of reviews of police conduct, and I believe some initiation of firing officers that were doing the wrong things. The federal monitor, which I mentioned, she went to the court and basically asked the court to give her authority to review all of the police action during those the weekend of May 31st and the days that followed. So I think ultimately that's going to get a very thorough review, and that will be a transparent outcome of what happens. So I think that those are some of the checks and balances that are in place currently. I'm unsatisfied with the Alderman's reasoning against support of CPAC and would like to know why he thinks preserving the system of policing is worth doing, as well as he can account for denouncing accountability. So I've said this before, I'm not for the status quo. I'm not for leaving things the way they are. I will also add that part of the reason the GAPA ordinance is stalled is because there are people that are against it. There are city council members that oppose it. The FOP opposes it. Lots of other people have opposed it. So it's something that we are working to get past, but there have been forces that want the status quo. And I think we've been pushing against them to try to change the system to make it more just and more transparent and more accountable. I understand your hesitation to blow up the system, but if GAPA's commission can only make recommendations and all members are ultimately indirectly appointed by the mayor, what guarantees that GAPA will bring reform? I think what I've heard for the 3 years that I've been working on this is the importance of civilian oversight and having a community voice, where the community at the district level, but also citywide, can have a say in policy, have a say in who are the leadership of these important policing functions for our city. I think having that itself is something that would have a phenomenal impact. We've never had that in Chicago. I think that's another thing that's very important to say, is we've never had that. The GAPA model is based on an LA model that was put in after the Rodney King beating and the riots that ensued following, and the reforms from a consent decree in LA. The model that we are having is an elected component where there's district council members, and that was having elected district council voice is critical and was heard critically. So I think that we look at this as a positive reform, but it's something that a lot of folks who want the status quo have been fighting against, which is unfortunately why it's taken this long to be enacted. And they have a couple more, and then we'll kind of go to open to Q&A, live Q&A. A risk of putting reforms only in the police contract is that they could be undone by future contracts. Are there other reforms that could be enacted outside of CPAC, GAPA, and what's the plan on enacting those? I think that a lot of the reforms that I mentioned from the consent decree, a lot of reforms that happened before the consent decree, like body-worn cameras and de-escalation and more funding and more training for crisis intervention, all of those are key aspects to, I think, positive reform. I think also being able to try to look for officers that have high concentrations or high incidents of violence, I think is a critical aspect that we also want to make sure, as part of the consent decree, that if there are individuals that have committed violence against any individuals, but African Americans and Hispanics, that's being looked at and they're not on the job and they're not out policing the streets of Chicago. I understand your support for GAPA ordinance over CPAC, but regardless of which, if either of those ordinance becomes law, what is your position on significantly reducing the budget and narrowing the function of police? So what I will say is that I'm not for abolishing the police. I think given the violence that we see in Chicago, we need policing in Chicago, but we need better policing in Chicago. I think that's critical, and a more just policing. As far as defunding the police goes, the majority of the budget for CPD is for personnel and for staff. And if we get to defund the police, we're going to be getting rid of a lot of the newer officers. The city of Chicago, with my support in recent years, has really done an aggressive outreach campaign to African American and Hispanics to become police officers. And that's something that if we begin to lay people off, I think a lot of those newer officers would be affected. I think it's critical for the police to move forward, that we have a very diverse workforce, so that around the city, the individuals are seeing people that look like them in the police cars and are solving the problems. I think that's a critical aspect of it. So I think that, but I am constantly, as a member of the budget committee, looking to find ways to, one, make sure that we're not wasting money, and two, specifically try to put money where it's needed for social workers, for after school programs, for mental health. That's something that I've done throughout my career, and something I will continue to do, including recently with the CARES Act funding, that we put money significantly for after school outreach. Was another aspect of it, is trying to use grants to hire individuals who can be out in the communities, talking to people about violence and not getting involved in violence, is another critical aspect that I want to see expanded. So one last question, and we'll throw it open to all of you to ask in a moderated way through Ally. In light of all the protests and continuing police brutality and code of silence, why have you refused to consider anything but GAPA, which is stalled and unchanged for 3 years? It has been changing, and it says this seems to defeat the purpose of a town hall. So we always gather and we have town halls. I would rather they be in person, quite honestly. But we're going to continue to talk. and for me to hear your perspective. And I'm very open-minded. So I think I've laid out a lot of concerns, and many of you may hear that I'm not open-minded, but I am. I want to listen to you, and I think that's going to help inform me moving forward. I will tell you that I think the current CPAC ordinance will not get passed as in its current form. I think that we'll see what the outcomes of the conversations are with the leadership of the GAPA organizations and CPAC. But I think that that's something I'm going to be very involved in, and I'll continue to keep you informed on an open and transparent way through my email and through responding to your emails and phone calls and town halls like this. So with that, I will open it up to questions from panelists, and we're going to do this until 8 o'clock tonight. So we have an hour and 12 minutes to do this, and I appreciate it. So Allie, I will let you call out who.
Okay, sounds good. And just so everyone knows, your camera will not come on, but you will have your microphone enabled. And I'm just gonna go in order of hands raised. So our first hand raised is Megan Brand, and you should be unmuted, Megan.
Hi, I have been talking with Alderman Osterman for years about police accountability, and what I've heard is what I've heard tonight is a lot of lies. If I hadn't researched well, I might believe what I was hearing, but I know better, and I've seen you vote for a $200 million police academy to be built across the street from a predominantly Black high school. And even after those youth came to Edgewater to tell you, to beg you not to vote for it, and even after the mayor hired a company that was known to defraud the government about this, what I've heard from you tonight is all lies. There's just one more that I'd like to talk about. It is the fact that you have completely ignored the fact that law professors from Northwestern University and the University of Chicago on March 13th sent you and other members of the City Council a letter supporting CPAC and urging you to support CPAC. They gave you legal research. You're saying that there are legal concerns about this document. That is, again, a lie. The University of Chicago, their legal team has said that state law would not need to change. There's so many other things that you have said tonight that are inaccurate. This is about self-determination. If we look at the over 95 co-sponsors of CPAC, they are predominantly Black-led organizations. Of the 19 alder people who have already come out in support of CPAC, only 18 of them are people of color, right? That says a lot, right? This is about self-determination. I am a white person, and I've only been harassed by police once in Chicago. I've been whistled at by police on duty, but my Black and brown neighbors have, especially my Black friends who live in North Lawndale, have been continually harassed. And when I drive to North Lawndale for meetings and I see police pulling people over nonstop for minor traffic violations, for other things, and here in our neighborhood, I see very few police, right? And I don't want to see police. I think it is a waste of our tax money. We spend way more than other cities on policing. There are over 40% of our city's annual operating budget goes to policing. The militarized violence that we saw when they kidnapped and beat my friends and our neighbors and arrested over 2,000 people for nonviolent protesting. And yes, those arrests were for protesting. The vast majority of them were not for looting. And the way that this has been handled, the amount of money that we have poured into it, and Harry Osterman, I have sat with you and talked with you about this for years. And for the first time, you send an email saying Black Lives Matter. but you talk out of both sides. You say Black Lives Matter, but then you consistently vote for policy, you vote to increase police funding, and you have done nothing. You are the vice chair of the Public Safety Committee, and yet we're 70% behind on meeting the consent decree demands. That is your fault. You have failed to lead this, and the mayor has also failed to lead this. I watched Mayor Lightfoot. I was at the police board meeting when she laughed in the face of Rakia Boyd's brother. Rakia Boyd, who was murdered by an off-duty cop while walking in the park one afternoon. Her brother went to speak. Lori Lightfoot cut him off after 2 minutes, and she laughed in his face. And that is who you want to be in charge through GAPA, of appointing people, of deciding who, you think that she will hold police accountable? She has failed. She has failed and failed and failed to hold people accountable. And I would much rather see 11 people who are elected from our community, as would the law professors of Northwestern, as would the law professors of University of Chicago, as would all of these Black organizations, Black-led organizations that have sponsored CPAC, as would all the youth who are fighting in our streets today, who are risking their lives for this. I am absolutely appalled by your inaction in this, and I think that you are complicit. And you said in your recent email that you have a lot to learn about race and racism. Harry Osterman, we have been inviting you to anti-racism trainings, ones that are held in our own community, ones that have been done by CROAR at Loyola University and other places. We have been inviting you for years. You haven't come to one. You haven't been doing the work. This is not a new issue. You know this problem. You've seen this problem and consistently done nothing. And I do not trust you, and I encourage my neighbors not to trust you either. Lastly, the issue of schools. There is, I challenge you to cite one single study of police in schools that can document that schools have been made safer by policing. Because I have given you many studies, I have sent them to you, and so have my neighbors, of police terrorizing and harming students. And I believe that CPS students need to be kept safe. Pierce Elementary School, where my child goes, has a full-time restorative practices person. There should be one at every school. There is not, right? That full-time restorative practices person makes a huge difference and responds to incidents without escalating, and is not a cop, and does not cause terror, and does not provoke trauma. Students can't learn when they are being policed, when the people who have put their families in jail, when the people who brutalized their families are sitting outside their classroom door. They cannot learn in that environment. If you cared about students, we would get those police out of there now, not next year. Your plan for waiting a year it's a complete joke, Harry Osterman. This is not, if this were your life on the line, or your children's life on the line, you wouldn't be doing this. And this is not okay. I just strongly disagree with what you have said. And I urge you to vote for CPAC. I urge my neighbors to really do the research and not believe what you are saying, because there's a lot of lies that have been said tonight.
Are you done?
Yes.
Okay. So Megan, you covered a lot of ground in kind of calling me a liar through most of it. But let me just go over a couple things. I said before, I'm not a lawyer, and I think that there are legal arguments on both sides of the issue. And I think that I will send you and your husband the legal arguments related to the CPAC ordinance and the GAPA ordinance. I think the GAPA ordinance has done a lot of legal work to make sure it'll hold legal muster. I think You can look at it or not and interpret it. I think here's the ultimate thing. I'm not the arbitrator of decision about the legality of it. And I didn't get into legality, a lot of it tonight. You brought up the issue of self-determination. And I think you brought up the issue of your frustration with my vote on the new police and fire academy on the west side. That was greatly informed by a woman named Emma Mitz. Emma Mitz is the alderman of the 37th Ward in a community that sees significant violence and saw significant unrest during the most recent, the unrest that we saw in the city of Chicago. She campaigned on that issue. And I think for me as a North Side white alderman, to not listen to my African-American colleague about why she believes she wants the police academy in her community, I think that would be wrong of me to do. Additionally, part of the core problems that we have with CPD is a lack of adequate training. And I have gone to the police academy, the current one, and there are people that are being trained in hallways. Having a place where there's significant room to do training, I think, is critical. So I think that's why I think my decision about voting for that, I sat and listened with you, and that helped inform me. But ultimately, I felt that the right thing to do was to support the new academy, and I had significant support from African-American aldermen on the west side of Chicago. You bring up schools, and part of this, Megan, I thought we were close to agreeing on something, and that is that what I said is that I'm open to transitioning police out of schools. You brought up Pierce School. Pierce School has a police officer who's off duty, who's there at the front desk every single day. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's true. And I have heard voices from you and from other people and listened to young people, and I believe that we should get police out of schools and try to get social workers and security guards. But there are real issues related to schools. And I think that I listen to Senn High School and other high school principals. There has to be a way to do it, but doing it overnight, I think, would be a significant problem. I think we have to be thoughtful about how to do it and make sure that every school has the safety that it needs. And I think listen to those schools that may want security. But I think that that's what I said today at the committee, and that's going to be action that I follow up on. So I think I appreciate your comments as always, and we'll go to the next question.
All right, Martin Levine should be. I think you'll need to unmute yourself. You should be able to unmute yourself, Martin. We will come back. Oh.
I have unmuted. I'm sorry.
Nope, you're unmuted. You're good.
Alderman, thank you for listening. And I want to, I think, say it's a hard act to follow Megan, who came before me. She made many of the points I would have liked to make. I would like to point out to you that two things I think are urgent to me. One, urgency. I've spent today in a discussion with many of my friends looking at the situation the country is in and reflected on the fact that many of the kinds of words about change are reflected in speeches made when I was much younger, 50 years ago, when we faced similar moments in this country, and all of us failed to make the kind of changes we needed. We're talking about making changes that you've been working on 3 years to craft the perfect response, and we're still talking about it. And I still hear from you a kind of patience and not a sense of urgency. That things need to change now, and they need to change in a direction many of us have refused to recognize. They need to listen to the pain of our neighbors who have 400 years of history of our failing. Secondly, you're defending a plan that by and large is built on the foundation that has not worked. In a city in which mayoral power has a long history, you want to build a system which depends on mayoral power. You want to build a system that trusts the moral position of a singular leader, and we are a city where that has failed. We live in the most segregated city, housing-wise, in the United States. We live in a city which is driving out many of its citizens of color because they can no longer afford to live here. And I think the urgency of the moment says the most radical changes are the directions we need to go. We failed to do that 50 years ago, and we're now paying the price. So let me back off. I do not know why you want to defend the patience of the system and the patience to wait to see if the same system will work. Thank you.
Martin, I appreciate that, and I think I would not take my tone or my demeanor is not a sense of urgency. I'm on the phone constantly with my colleagues to try to get something passed, and I have been as frustrated. I can't even explain my frustration that we have not passed this ordinance previously. I think part of what you also, so I think I understand the issue, and I want to be bold. I want to make sure that we're making significant fundamental change that will put Chicago on a path for a different 50 years ahead, and a different 50 years ahead for Black and brown residents of Chicago. I think it goes beyond policing, but policing is at a core because of the past abuses in Chicago. It goes towards community building, and it goes towards housing. I chair the housing committee. I'm the chairman of that committee. And we're looking at ways to help support communities on the south and west side that, as you bring up 50 years, some of them lost buildings in the riots following the death of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy that were never rebuilt. And I think that's unconscionable. So I think that there are going to be ongoing efforts with a sense of urgency to do that. But I think I share with you the sense of urgency. And I think that in the next month or so, we're going to see some changes and some votes. But I think part of this is, and I'll go back to what I said, is trying to make sure that the system that we put in place will work and do what we want to do. And I think that is to build trust, have an accountability system that makes sure that we're not allowing officers to abuse and minorities in the city of Chicago, and come up with a better system of policing and accountability. So I think that while there's a rush to get something done, it's got to be done in a way that will last for the next 50 years, taking on the last 50 and the mistakes that we've made. But thank you for your points.
All right, next up is Caroline or Carolyn. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I just want to repeat something back to you that you just said. You said, I share with you a sense of urgency. Forgive me, I live right next to the train, so there might be some background noise. You said, I share with you a sense of urgency. I think that in the next month or so, we're going to see some changes. And I think that kind of reflects a lot of what I've been hearing from you, not just tonight, but throughout your entire statements on this issue. I'm hearing a lot of buzzwords, and I'm hearing a lot of talking without really saying anything. I'm hearing you say a lot of things to indicate that you're incorporating a certain vocabulary that's meant to placate rather than to actually implement any kind of change. I actually asked a question of you beforehand that you answered, but not really. I asked you to specifically lay out what your concerns were and what you actually thought the worst of CPAC. And you kind of just gave the same spiel that you gave in your newsletter. So I would, one, encourage you to really speculate and lay out what you believe will happen if CPAC goes through. Question number one. Question number two, I also heard you say that you're going to incorporate more social workers into police calls, which I think is a great idea. But I also think that it is equally irresponsible to do that without also addressing the inherent racism in social work. That makes sense? A lot of Black and brown communities fear social work in the same way that they fear the police because of child protective services. And just, I think what we're learning right now is that these trained professionals that you trust over the civilians are prone to corruption in a way that has not been fully addressed. And I think that by refusing to defund the police, you are just upholding those structures. And I kind of call,
Go ahead and say it. You can swear if you want to, Caroline.
I don't want to, because I don't want to kneecap my statement. But truly, I encourage you to just be brave in what you're saying and not placate. And I don't know, that's kind of the end of what I wanted to say. I'm hearing a lot of talking without hearing a lot of actual meaning.
Okay, well, I think the point you brought up about social workers is a new one to me, because I think a lot of the calls that I've heard recently is that, and maybe the term social worker is different, but I think part of what I've heard recently and part of what I'm open to is that oftentimes what happens now on the ground, and try to be very clear, people call 911. If they see a homeless person, if they see someone who's off their meds, who's acting out, they call 911. And police are then called to respond and to deal with that. And my point is, which I think a lot of people agree to, is that there needs to be a middle ground or a mechanism to try to have people that can come out to help solve problems that are not the police. I think the city of Chicago has had a terrible track record when police have been called to situations that didn't involve the police, and people have been harmed from that. Locally, what we have done when we have situations, and we've had these throughout our neighborhood, we work with the Department of Family Services, and they come out and basically look at supporting individuals that need help. So I think your point about the social work aspect of it and inherent racism, I think that's a new one to me. If you want to email, or we could follow up online about that. I think part of this is to say that in communities across Chicago, there needs to be another way to respond to people in crisis without the police. And whether that's an outreach worker who's trained to work with people that are ex-offenders or people that are getting involved in gangs, or whether that's a church or a foundation or a community organization, that was kind of what I was getting at. I think part of what I've heard about defunding the police is to not take funding away from police and just have it go someplace else, but to have that money redirected into supportive services. So that was kind of the issue about social workers. The issue that I'm fearful of CPAC is that basically we're going to create a system that on the top sounds good. And in theory, all of us would support a candidate or 11 candidates and they would do the right thing. There's no guarantees in that. Okay, there's no guarantees that that system would work. The other thing which I bring up in a very localized level about is my concern is that Thorndale is the boundary between the 20th and the 24th Police District. And my fear is that if someone is elected as one of the district council members who would sit on policy but also do investigative work, are they going to judge police wrongdoings different on one side of the street versus the other? Are people on the northwest side or southwest side of Chicago going to treat police misconduct differently than they do in Woodlawn or in South Shore? So my concern is that we create a system where there's not an evil or not a level of accountability, that it's different by where you live and where you go. And I think that's a system that would be worse than what we have today. So that's the worst part of my suggestion. The other part is, those would be the ones that I would confine it to. So I think other than what I've said before, and I'm trying not, I'm trying to be very direct and transparent, and I think I've tried to do that as an elected official in our community. So thank you for the question, though.
And Caroline, I see you have your hand up again, but we have 37 other people that want to ask questions, so I want to respect them. I'll leave your hand up if we can get to you for the follow-up. Otherwise, please email the alderman. Okay. Next up is A. Lynch. You should be able to unmute yourself. Oh, sorry, I might have just muted you. I'm sorry. Okay.
Hello? Yes? Okay. Hi. I heard a lot about accountability in your previous remarks, Alderman, and I have to admit that I have not seen much accountability during the last month, the last year, the last several years that I've lived in this community. I know that there was a brief moment here. This is my first question. I actually have two. And a quick comment. The first question is that I noticed that you had a brief sort of side statement about young people at corners, and specific statements made by our newly appointed superintendent of police, appointed by our mayor. And given that the statements suggested that young people would be racially profiled, specifically on the south and west sides of the city, would be rounded up this weekend and arrested and held in arrest during a pandemic, which to me sounds like a deliberately bad idea. And in that one example, I would love to hear about how you specifically and how your constituents specifically who are calling for accountability on something as small as that, because honestly, just that statement is really small compared to a lot of the violence that people are experiencing at the hands of police. How are you expecting that to happen? How do you expect to hold somebody accountable in that situation, given our current setup? My second question is that a lot of people, and I know it's not just me, and maybe you get to talk to a lot of different people that a lot of us don't get to talk to because we're stuck at home and maybe are furloughed. And
I was stuck at home too, but
the second question is, if you're unwilling to listen to your constituents, why do you continue to hold this position? And finally, I would just like to add that it is offensive to describe someone as a Black or a Hispanic. They are Black people and they are Hispanic people. Thank you, that's all.
okay. The point you brought up about the comments of the superintendent of police, I don't agree with that policy that he wants to enact, and I'm going to reach out to him in the mayor's office. I think that unlawfully rounding people up, I don't think adds safety. I think it's short-sighted. We are in the middle of a pandemic. So I don't agree with that. And whether it's the south or west side or it's Thorndale or Argyle, I think that that's a wrong thing to do. And I'm telling you that, and I will tell them that as well. And I think I'll monitor how this weekend goes on a lot of fronts, but how that's implemented. I think that that shows, I think, a system that has not worked and very clearly erodes trust amongst young people and the police. I think if young people, Black people, Hispanic people who are young are harassed for no reason, I think that causes a deep effect on them that lasts with them. And I think part of the problems that we're dealing with across the city today are because of those past injustices. I think that I listen to the people in our community. I think I've done that for 9 years as alderman and 11 years as state representative. I think I'm also very transparent. The matters that we're talking about on these two ordinances were ordinances that came up during the last election cycle when I ran for re-election. I was against CPAC then. I was very public about it then. I was in support of GAPA, and I was public about that as well. I went to a town hall meeting at a church in our neighborhood, and I talked about that. I didn't hide my feelings about it. I was open about it. And I think that the outcome of the last election is what it is. But I think I'll say this, the moment that we're in, the crisis that we're in as a country, seeing the death of George Floyd, all of these things have had an impact on me, and I'm keeping an open mind in addition to listening to you. So I think that, and talking to other people around the city and people in our community. So I think that I continue to inform myself and reflect on this, and I hope that answers the question. And thank you for both of them.
All right, next up is Shira Wilson. So you should be able to unmute, Shira.
Hello. So I wanted to make, oh, I have a picture. I wanted to make a couple statements about some of the points that you've said. First, I do have a question, but some of the things that you have said I think are misrepresentations. You mentioned the way that GAPA versus CPAC would be selected and the fear of outside influence impacting CPAC. CPAC explicitly states that no one in law enforcement, no one who has been an officer, no one with officers in their immediate family can be part of it. And I think that that is a very clear distinction between CPAC and GAPA. You mentioned that civil rights is a primary component for searching for GAPA members, but it can also include law enforcement. And so more law enforcement involved in a committee to oversee law enforcement is just unacceptable. Also, you mentioned the push to hire diverse officers to improve policing in the city. It doesn't matter if the rank and file officers are Black and brown, because we do not have officers who are Black and brown who are in superior positions, and that is what changes the culture. So what can you do to improve that? I don't believe that there is a push that City Council can do to change the promotion practices of the CPD, and without changes to the top significantly, it needs to be at least 30%. That's been proven across every study of diversity, that change does not happen unless there's 30% leadership. Without that change, there will not be a change to the culture of policing in this city. Finally, you mentioned that you're against police abolition because of the violence in our city. Well, we've had a police department in this city that has been extremely violent since the founding of the city, and it has been an extremely well-funded police department, and yet our city is still violent. So I would challenge you that the police are actually not doing anything to address the violence in this city. And in fact, the money that we are spending on policing should be diverted to the community organizations that exist. There is leadership in the South and the West sides within their own community to abate gang violence, because the people living in those communities do not want it. So why are we diverting more money to policing to stop gang violence when it's not happening? So those are just some points that you made that I think are misrepresentations and I wanted to address. My actual question regards the fact that the consensus among all agencies that study policing and accountability in this country, including the most recent letter that was issued by University of Chicago and Northwestern Law Universities, have all stated that police reform without the ability to implement it by citizen oversight. So it's not just enough that the civilians have oversight. Without the ability to inform and enact it, it doesn't mean anything. So why are you ignoring the consensus of experts when it comes to this police reform? Why are you insisting that another panel that can contribute input but cannot determine the budget, cannot fire misconduct? Why are you supporting this method that we know does not work and is the consensus of experts that it will not work? It is a Band-Aid that has been tried multiple times. I don't know why you would cite a model from LA, because LA is clearly in disarray. Their police department is awful. So I don't know why we would want to implement reforms from there. Sorry, this was very convoluted and I hope that it comes through. I feel like you are constantly ignoring what we are saying, and I believe that your talking points and your rebuttals to these things are not accurate, and I don't believe they reflect the actual data that supports it. I believe that they reflect a consolation to the police union, and without addressing the police union and having a civilian arm that can actually have a say and stop them and implement oversight, I don't think that we're going to do anything that actually creates real significant change. We keep trying versions of the same method over and over again, and it is not working. So to summarize, sorry, this got away from me.
No, you're doing great.
Why are you ignoring the consensus of experts on what actually works with police reform? To speak to what you said, what would be done to improve the culture of policing by getting officers ranking higher? Because we cannot just rely on hiring officers alone. They have to be in charge of it. And what is the purpose of police if they're not actually addressing the violence in this city? Why can we not divert the efforts to the communities that are interceding in their own behalf? I think that covers it.
Okay, so I'll try to get all of those points. One is, I will tell you that you brought up the issue of abolishing the police. I will tell you that my African-American aldermanic colleagues on the South and West Side don't want to do that. They want police, they want better police and patrolling in a more effective, just way in their community. There's a lot of resources, financial resources going to community organizations, and recently $20 million to outreach workers to hire men from and women from the community to go out and do gang interventions to try to minimize the violence. But to try to say that abolishing the police and giving the money to the community is going to improve safety is not founded in what is actually going on in communities in the South and West Side. And I'm happy to have some of my colleagues and some community organizations come up or do a Zoom call and talk to you about the real issues that are going on the ground, and not from a perspective of us on the North Side, but from those folks who have to deal with the violence that has gone on the last 2 weekends and likely will go on this weekend. You bring up experts. We had a subject matter hearing on CPAC and GAPA down at City Council, and there was one person who spoke who helped draft the ordinance for CPAC, and there were other people that were national experts from Los Angeles and New York who study police reform across the country, not just in our neighborhood or our city, but across the country, and look for the best practices. And I will tell you that they are more aligned with the GAPA model than they are with CPAC. I think there is no model like CPAC anywhere else in the country, United States of America. And I think that is, there's a reason for that. So I think that, notwithstanding the legal arguments, which I'll let the lawyers kind of battle that out, from a police reform expert standpoint, there's not any real support for the CPAC model. There's not any examples of the CPAC model working or being implemented anywhere in the country. And I think that for the size of the city, Chicago, and the challenges that we face, going that route where it's never been done before, I think should be very concerning. You bring up African-American and Hispanic police officers and a lack of supervision. For someone to become a supervisor, they have to become a police officer. And if we're not having officers that are hired and trained and promoted, I think then we're not going to get the leadership as captains, as lieutenants, as commanders, as superintendents. So the city has done an active outreach and will continue to do that. But I think that you don't get minority supervisors by not hiring minority officers. So I think that it's a process, and one that we have undertaken. We have an African-American police superintendent right now. There are efforts within the police department to promote more minorities. They changed the promotion law or the promotion process recently to try to get away from some of the favoritism within the police department. So there are reforms that are going on a lot of different levels. Having a more uniform or diverse police force, I think, is important for the city of Chicago. And that's something I am supportive of and will continue to fight for. Next question.
Sorry. Next up is Chris Doyle. Okay, and I think I unmuted you, Chris.
Hi. So you stated that the GAPA, I forget what the CCPSA, I forget the long version. The GAPA Council has final policymaking authority, and that sounds good, I guess. But what I'm wondering though is that in reading the GAPA legislation, it does provide that policymaking authority, but then there's a paragraph that describes what happens if the department does not agree with the policies that are created. And so it's setting up this consensus process between the GAPA Council and the department. And so it has this process where if there's a disagreement, it goes to sort of a public forum. And then it says, at the conclusion of this review process, the commission may adopt a policy recommendation by the affirmative vote of a majority of the commission. And so the word recommendation is what I'm reacting to here. A recommendation is not a policy. And so I'm wondering, do you actually support GAPA Council having the full and final policymaking authority? And if so, will you commit to disambiguating this sentence that makes it sound like they, in the event of a disagreement, that GAPA does not have the final authority?
Yes and yes. I think, Chris, it's an outstanding question, as are all the questions I've heard tonight. But part of where we are right now in the process, in addition to the leadership of CPAC and GAPA talking about where they are, is the issue of policy. And that has been one that has been being negotiated with the mayor's office for quite some time. I think that policy making is, there's a lot that goes into it. But I think that from my perspective, having the commission have final say on policy is critical. I think that that's supported by members of the GAPA coalition. So that's something that I commit to. And I think a final version of that would come up for a vote in city council will, as you term, unambiguous, we'll clean that up and make sure that it's clear. But I think from my perspective, that's very important, and I'm glad you asked the question. So I think that as we move forward and the language of the ordinances are refined, you'll see more clarity about that.
All right, next question is from Kristen Brody. So you should be able to unmute. Yep.
Hi, Alderman Osterman, Kristen Brody. We have spoken on a number of occasions about police reform in a couple of different ways, and we have not, I have not seen any action on your part in the past. You're always very open to speaking and meeting, which I appreciate, but demands are not met. As was mentioned by Megan, we met with you several times about the new police academy, and you chose to ignore the cries of that actual community being affected in favor of alder people who have systematically failed their communities by ignoring the divestment that leads to these crime levels and instead calling for more police, which research shows does not prevent crime or even solve crime in the case of the Chicago Police Department. I also met with another neighbor about doing a test pilot to potentially hire social workers to accompany police to do mental health calls. That didn't happen. My concern is, I appreciate that you're saying these things. I appreciate we're having this conversation, but many of the people that you're deferring to, alder people in power on the South and West Side, have systematically ignored the demands of their people. Black Lives Matter Chicago's demands are not North Side white people demands. They are demands of the community to do things like pass CPAC, to defund the police and instead divert those resources to community needs that actually prove to reduce crime. And they also are imploring the city and CPS to remove police from schools. So I appreciate this conversation, but the people that you're deferring to do not speak for the people they're representing. And in addition to that, they may be giving anecdotal examples, but the research doesn't support that. The research is really clear. It's laid out in a federal consent decree that's not being followed. So a couple of things. Will you commit to removing school resource officers from schools, looking at the research and not deferring and saying I'm not an expert, but really looking at that research and seeing that those don't work? They do not keep schools safer. They actually are harmful for students of color and students with disabilities. And even in CPS, the way that that's been pushed over to local school councils hasn't been done equitably. It's a rush decision over the summer. It's not a process that makes any sense or really gives communities any power. Nor does it really take into account the research that's there that shows that these police are harmful. If we have clear-cut research saying these people are hurting our children, our most vulnerable children, the time is now to act and remove them, period. That $33 million could easily go to resources that are already in place in CPS. CPS already has a huge restorative justice program that it just doesn't fund. It has a CTU contract that it needs to fulfill, putting nurses and social workers and counselors in schools. So that structure is already in place. A year is too late. Our children are they're suffering now. They need those resources more than ever, especially in light of COVID. So are you willing to commit to that, one? And then two, are you willing to commit to reducing the current Chicago Police Department budget and redirecting these funds to things like economic investments, environmental, ending environmental racism that's going on right now, when you look at Petco and things like that? Really the things that are proven, research proven, and I'm not talking about a couple of experts from LA and New York who are implementing systems that don't work. I mean academic research data that I have sent you, that I know Megan Brand has sent you, and I'm sure many others have. Are you willing to look at that and really vote to reduce 40% of our city's budget and instead reallocate those resources to things that work? More police don't work. It's really, really clear. Less police and more resources absolutely work. And that's why it's being done across this country in other markets, whether it's in the Midwest or in other areas out West. So are you willing to at least look at those two things and make some commitments there? And also, I hear a lot of your willingness to have an open mind around CPAC, but having an open mind and committing to real police reform and anti-racist change is not the same thing. So instead of kind of kicking the ball off to, well, I'll leave that to the experts, I'll leave that to this. Experts have reached out to you. Constitutional law experts had said, this is what we recommend. Black Lives Matter Chicago is saying, this is what we want. And so the choice is clear. Will you commit to instead of just saying, I'll keep an open mind, really coming up with actual reasons why that are not these, I mean, I appreciate that you took the time to go through this, but again, a lot of this has been said by other speakers. Many of these reasons don't hold water. Are you willing to really take a look at CPAC and have a real conversation about it and abide by the lives of not white Northsiders here only? And that's an assumption about this group of people too, but also Black Lives Matter Chicago.
That's not an assumption I made.
I understand, but it was something that you said about how how white Northsiders, us on the North Side may see the need for less police, and the underpinnings of that argument is a race-based one, which I would invite you to any number of trainings and we could talk more about from an anti-racist perspective. So on those 3 points, SROs, police budget, a real look at CPAC, listening to the voices of people in the communities, Asada's daughter, the Brighton neighborhood, I mean, people that are on the ground, on the streets. Are you willing to really heed those?
So Kristen,
guys?
a couple things if I can. One is, I guess, action. I have done action, and you bring up Gowdy School to me often, and we were able to get them money that you asked for. So that's part of my action, right? Passing legislation of this magnitude is not myself, one person. I've got to get 34 people to support this. And that takes time, that takes conversations. You kind of dismiss my colleagues on the South and West Side as not speaking for their constituencies. I don't know how that's based. I think all these people were elected by people in their community. They were elected after they took positions on issues like the Police and Fire Training Academy. So for you to dismiss that and say, well, they don't speak for their community, I think they speak very well for their community. I think that I've been out there recently and trying to help support them after many of them lost their businesses and lost some of the grocery stores to help provide food and shelter, food for some of their residents. The impact on them, because they care and love their community so much, I don't think you should underpin how deeply committed they are to their neighborhood. And I think the deep challenge that they face when it comes to safety, because when I talk to them, this is something that they live every single day and their residents do every single day. So when they ask me for something or they bring up concerns they have in their community, I listen to them, because they are dealing with things that are very significant every single day, and they've been elected to do that. So I try to find a way to support them. Specifically, you bring up the budget for CPD. I don't support changing things unilaterally overnight. And I think that having the police leave CPS without any plan for safety in the schools is not a responsible thing to do. What I have said is I am supportive of transitioning them out during this school year to make sure that there's a safety plan in place, to make sure that there's significant amount of social workers that are needed to be hired. I think just removing them with no backdrop, I think puts our schools and our students most specifically without the support that they need. So what I'm trying to say is I'm supportive of this, but I think it has to be thoughtful and done in a way that will make sure our schools get the support that they need. As far as your comment about keeping an open mind, I am keeping an open mind. And I always enjoy talking to you about issues in our community. I don't listen to experts. I review everything and I try to make the best informed decision that I can. And there are legal experts on both sides of these issues, but most of my points are not on the legal basis, but on the fundamental basis of it and on how would it be implemented. And I think one thing I haven't heard from anybody on this call is what happens if it passes and is implemented, and no one has brought up or answered the concerns that I've raised about the operational on the ground effect of this after it's done. True safety and true accountability in our city is not going to happen when an ordinance is passed. No one's popping champagne bottles. It's when it's felt on the ground, it's when it's been lived, and when people on the South and West Side feel that the system in place is just and that the police are working with them instead of against them. And if a system's in place that undercuts that sets us back even further. So I think I try to be very clear about my concerns, and I think no one has raised any counterpoints to the specific concerns that I brought up. So we will continue to talk about this, and I do so in an open-minded way, and I'll continue to do that.
All right, next up is Antonio Rodriguez.
Hi.
Hi.
I do just want to say something that you said a few moments ago, Alderman. You used the reason that since something like CPAC hasn't been done before, that's a concern of yours. And I just think that's such a shame to hear my elected representative say that they fear doing something because it hasn't been done before. Because how else could any meaningful change have ever been achieved if no one dared to be bold and try it? So I encourage you to think about tapping into the bravery that is needed in this moment to save the lives of Chicagoans. I also have a specific question for you. I feel, after listening to your answers tonight, that you have failed to explain exactly why having the mayor appoint a police commissioner is so much better than an 11-person board of actual Chicago citizens who were democratically elected. And I would just like to further ask, if the existing federally mandated reforms enforced by this consent decree that you express great faith in are already lagging in enforcement by 70%, why do you think that more of those same kinds of enforcements will suddenly work, rather than trying something new, a democratically elected board of Chicago citizens that has the power to bring actual accountability to the police force? I would really love an answer to that question. Why you believe that a system that is not even being enforced, 70% of the required reforms are not being enforced. Why do you believe that continuing down that path is the right option right now? Thank you.
Great questions. A couple things I would say. The consent decree is what I would define as relatively new. It's about, I'll say, 8 months to a year old, maybe a little bit longer. CPD has been in the process of implementing the reforms and staffing up to do that. So staffing internally to have the people to do that. I'm not happy at all. I think I am very angry and frustrated that we have not made more progress towards achieving the goals. The reality is that as a city and CPD, we're not going to be out, we will not be without under the cloud of the consent decree until we've met those goals. So we are federally bound to make those changes. It's not an option for us to do. We have to do it, and it has to be done with a sense of urgency. So I think that I strongly support the changes that have been court required, and will continue to do so with much more of a sense of urgency. You bring up the issue of being bold, and I totally agree with that. My point about the fact that the model of CPAC has not been implemented anywhere in our country is a fact. And I think that this isn't an issue about trying to be bold, it's trying to make the right policy for the city. The GAPA model with civilian oversight has never been tried in Chicago. We have never had civilian oversight of CPD. So while people think that the GAPA model doesn't go far enough, we've never had that here. We've never had community voice helping oversee policy in the city of Chicago. I think that that is a significant step in the right direction and is bold. So I think that while we disagree on the model, I think the actions that we're looking to take are bold actions that will put our city in the right direction moving forward to make a more just, equitable city. So I think, I hope that I've answered those two questions.
Okay, the next question is from S.J. Lilly.
Hi, yes. My name's Sheena, and I had a question, but you said you were looking for an answer, an alternative. You're like, well, nobody's given me any idea as to what it would look like without police officers. So I kind of wanted to address that in that if we defunded police officers tomorrow, it's not going to look a whole lot different in the sense of right now, police officers can't predict crime. And so we're calling them in after the fact of these things happening anyway. So like, if we're worried about being robbed, which I actually, 2 months after I moved to Chicago, my car was stolen off of Winthrop Street. It still hasn't been returned. I called the police and they said, oh yeah, there's no way we'd be able to find it. So like, the police aren't really doing much in the way of preventing crime. They're just taking care of things after the fact. So there have been like tons of studies. I'm sure you've seen the memes that are running around like Instagram saying like, what does a world without police officers look like? It looks like a white suburb where everybody takes care of each other. And we don't have that constant police brutality and like just perpetuating that fear in our neighborhoods. So like you're wondering like, what does it look like without police? Like it looks like a suburb and a neighborhood of people taking care of each other, which I mean, like I recognize a lot of the names on this call tonight because these are my neighbors. And I think we live in such a great community of people who do take care of each other. So I'm telling you that the alternative exists. We don't have to imagine it very far. Like it's not something that's never been done in the world before. So like, there's your answer to that question. You're like, oh, so what does the alternative look like? Well, we have it. We've seen it. We're not imagining something that doesn't exist. But my original question was, you were concerned about young people who you're recruiting to be police officers. Or what happens if, you know, they get laid off? My question is, why don't we lay them off? Why don't we then use the money? Defunding the police isn't meaning we're just, you know, sitting on this pile of cash. Take that money and reallocate it to giving them job training or scholarships to be teachers. Put them in our schools as educators. Like I don't want how many millions of people here, gosh, because how many police officers do we have now? I don't want these thousands and thousands of formerly dangerous individuals who probably have my address roaming around without a job, just trying to look for trouble. No, I want them to have jobs. I want them to have jobs as educators and people who like can help, give them nursing training, put them in our hospitals and actually have them care for people. Like I know most people who want to be police officers, they're just like, I just want to help people. There are so many better ways you can help people. Be a doctor, be a nurse, be a teacher. So I'm saying like, why don't we, you're worried about like people going jobless. Why don't we give them job training? Like when we have to lay people off for being coal miners, you know, things like that. So my question is what is the fear of people losing their jobs as police officers when we can just give them, you know, new, better jobs to actually help the community? And then my other question was, like you had mentioned like you wanted trained professionals coming in the nights like after a shooting or whatever. How are they considered trained professionals? A lot of these individuals like barely have their high school diplomas. Like police officers don't require a high school diploma. That's not a lot of training. I think it's only a handful of hours you have to be, and then they give you a gun. So like, how are these officers trained, and how do you not have police officers goals? Like you don't have the goals of the police force, like their KPIs. Like I mean, this isn't like they're a major like stockholder. It's not like insider trading if they give us their goals and like what sales they have to meet. No, they work for us, the citizens. Like we should have absolute and utter insight as to what their goals are, as to like what it takes to quote unquote like be promoted. Because of course you hear all those rumors like, oh, after so many arrests they get promoted to sergeant or detective. Like why don't you as our elected official like have that insight? Why aren't they like, what are those goals? Why don't you have that already? So 3-part question, and those are my questions.
So if I could ask a follow-up, and I don't want your address, like, because I don't want anyone to know your address, but you said you live on Winthrop or Kenmore?
No, my car was stolen when it was parked on Winthrop.
Got it. So you brought up a lot of stuff. I think one is we don't live in a white suburb. We live in Edgewater, uptown Andersonville, and we live in the city of Chicago. And in the last week and a half, we've had 150 people that have been shot. We've had countless babies killed and shot. Part of the safety that we have enacted in our community, where to some folks that might be new to the neighborhood, we had a lot of violence on Kenmore and Winthrop throughout my upbringing. I'm 53 years old and I've lived here my entire life. So I've seen our community over many, many decades. And the safety that we have today that you talk about, and how people can feel safe walking down the street and neighbors can be on their front porches, that has been bound by neighborhood residents getting involved and improving the community. And it's been involved in adding social programs and after-school experiences, things like the library, the Broadway Armory, many other programs. But it's also been involved in partnership with the local police and having foot patrolmen on certain streets and working to address problem gang buildings and drug buildings. When I started 9 years ago as alderman, we had, I think, probably 10 or 12 people that were killed on an annual basis. We've had gang violence, we've had shootings on all parts of our neighborhood. So we have worked very, very hard in a very holistic way with residents, with business owners, with the police to have the safety that we have today. And that has taken us decades to do, and hard work, community building work, but work that makes it safer for everybody in our neighborhood. So that's something that I think is important to acknowledge. Things didn't just change overnight and everything's great. And the reality is that until we have safety in every single community in the city of Chicago, where we see the same partnership and the same programs and the same supports on the south and west side and other parts of the city, we're not safe, and our city is not in a good place. It's important that we have employment opportunities and economic development and great schools in every single neighborhood. We have to have that across the city of Chicago, and for far too long, there has been disinvestment. The current mayor and her team are trying to improve that. As a chairman of the housing committee, I want to improve affordable, stable housing around the city of Chicago. But policing is critical in that. I think part of what we've talked about tonight with accountability is to try to make sure that the system that is in place is holistic and works for everybody. So I think there's a reality that we live in. And I think that right now with the violence that we have, we're not a white suburb, and we're not going to be a white suburb. And I think that we have to deal with the reality, and that is that we need police, and the police are also out there to prevent crime. It's not them coming after your car was stolen. It's them to look at issues that are called in or emailed in ahead of time. And we have violence in our community even now. So I think policing is not about responding after the fact. It's about what they can do to stop people, taking people with guns off the street. That happens in our community. So I think that that's an ongoing thing that we deal with. And I think, but part of it is it's important to understand that our neighborhood is safe for all of our residents because of work that everyone's done in the past.
I did want to really quickly just acknowledge, like, yes, I do realize we don't live in a white suburb. Actually, according to the very last census, 60660 was known as like the most diverse zip code in the entire city of Chicago. I love to say, you know, we have one of everybody. It's a beautiful, wonderful neighborhood. I was trying to say, like, you were saying, like, what does it look like? And I'm saying, oh, it already exists in a white suburb. So I do acknowledge the incredible and wonderful diversity of our neighborhood. I just wanted to say, like,
so you and I
I
agree that diversity is our strength, and that neither one of us wants to be out in that so-called suburb. So I think that the diversity that we have kind of binds us all together, and I think that's something that we agree to.
Alderman, there is one other part of the question that I think needs to be clarified about who is currently investigating police misconduct.
So who currently investigates police misconduct is the COPA, which basically goes out and investigates police misconduct. And one of the things that I'd like to probably do moving forward is have the leadership of COPA do a town hall with us where she can walk through specifically what she does. And I think that all of you should, and I think in our email tomorrow, we'll put in their information about COPA so that if there are situations that happen in our community where someone is abused by the police or there's misconduct, people can file a complaint, and that's something that we encourage people to do. So we'll include that information. I think one of our future Zoom calls will include the leadership of COPA to talk through the specifics of what they do when they investigate police-involved misconduct.
All right, next up is Joel Thorson.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you, for having this town hall. I just had two really quick questions. So number one, my understanding is that part of the reason that the alderman supports GAPA is that it preserves the mayor's role in managing CPD and in public safety in the city in general. When Rahm Emanuel was mayor, he fought against releasing the video of Laquan McDonald's murder for political gain. So if he were still in City Hall, would you support GAPA? And would you want him to be involved in that process? Second question is actually really short.
Can I answer that quickly? No and no. I think he is on to different pastures, and I think I was frustrated that he did not embrace the GAPA ordinance a lot sooner, and your points about how he handled things are accurate. So I think that there's new leadership at the city, and I think a new city council as well. I think there are a lot of people that are looking at this issue differently, and I think that that's important.
And what happens if we get another Rahm Emanuel?
I don't think that we're going to be quite honest, but I think that's why people register to vote. I think that's why people come out to vote, and I think that while this is a government call, I would encourage everyone to vote, to register to vote and get their friends registered before the November election, and take advantage of voting in that election and future elections as well. I think, let me answer you this question, Joel. Regardless of if there's another Rahm Emanuel, I think if we have the civilian oversight and the city council ratifies those members on there, I think there's going to be significant power in that civilian oversight commission that's going to look at the policy of CPD and the implementation of CPD and the accountability system moving forward in a very open and transparent way, where we have not had that open transparency in the past. So I think this would be something that would change and be a fundamental change that would really help bring people into the system of trust. And I think on the local level, having local elected representatives like yourself or others who would want to run for the district council, they would have an on-the-ground active voice in what policing looks like in our community, as well as communities around the city of Chicago.
Well, I got to tell you, I disagree. I don't think GAPA is enough. And if anyone else in this call believes the same thing, look up 48th Ward Neighbors for Justice.
Is that a Facebook or is that an email?
That's where I can go.
You'll see soon.
Okay. So we're gonna have one more question for tonight, and then yes.
All right, last question of the night is Mary DeFino.
Hi there, Mary DeFino, school social worker on the West Side. And I have to say it's really interesting to hear you mention social workers so much tonight, because I distinctly remember being at St. Gertrude's Church this fall when you actually looked me in the eye and said that teachers shouldn't go on strike for more social workers, that there was a good offer on the table and that we should take the money. And so again, totally agree we need more social workers, but we needed you when that counted. I also want to clarify that BAM is a great program, but it's a nonprofit with really high turnover, and it's really not doing very much for our kids when there's an open revolving door of counselors coming in and out.
I think that's ridiculous, Mary, and I strongly encourage you to talk to the principals within our schools, at Senn, at Swift, at Gowdy, and ask them what BAM has done for the schools in our community.
It's a great attempt, but it does not replace a full-time social worker.
As well as talking to the BAM students yourself. So I think if you get a chance
I work
to
with
talk
BAM
to
students. I'm a school social worker, and that's what students need, a full-time adult. It's perverse that we're talking about looking to grant money to get more social workers. We're 4 times lower than the nationally recommended ratio for social workers in our school, but we're siphoning $33 million away from our school budgets to the police when we aren't even giving our kids the social workers and psychologists that professionals tell us they need. So that leads to my question. When do you see police being pulled out of schools, if not now? What are you going to do to make it happen? And what are you going to do to make sure that that $33 million goes back to our schools for support staff and programming and not back to the police? Because right now, this false choice where we're saying that LSCs get to decide, it's a farce. They have to choose between giving up a personnel, giving up an officer, and losing that money. We need to give the money back to the LSC so that they can choose how they would like to spend it on something meaningful. Like Kristen said, the research is just overwhelming, and a report saying that police are good for students in their schools does not exist. If there is, I would love to see it. So again, when do you see police being pulled out? What are you going to do to make it happen? And what are you going to do to make sure that $33 million stays in our schools? Because we've been defunding schools for decades in this city.
Well, Mary, I've been trying to put more money into schools. So every year, Chicago city budget actually gives surplus back to Chicago public schools. I also make sure the schools in our community, and I mentioned Gowdy before, gets the funding they need, as well as Pierce and Swift and Haight and Senn, all of which are phenomenal schools. It's disappointing to have me hear you say that BAM is a bad program, because when I look at the young African-American men, teenage boys who get the support and leadership and help that they need in our local schools. These are our kids in our neighborhood. It's really disappointing to have you say that that program's not working. I think that's very misguided, and I would encourage you again to talk to the principals. And if you know any of the students,
I'm not saying it's a bad program. I'm saying it does not replace a full-time social worker. And that it's perverse that we're trying
to answer your
give
question,
it
though.
to nonprofits and grant money instead of funding the schools in the way that we're supposed to. And I'm insulted that you would say that I don't care about my Black and brown students. Very insulted. I'm saying that you as an elected official have a responsibility to take care of and fund our schools instead of relying on a triage like a nonprofit or grant money. And there's $33 million that we're sitting on right now that's going to police instead of trained school staff. You can say you care about students, and you can show you care about students. And you can start
I've always, Mary, shown that I care about students, and I've always done that. And I have a long track record of doing that in our community and across the city of Chicago.
BAM is a good program. It does not replace a full-time professionally trained mental health professional.
The question is,
yes,
when
but
do we
you
get rid
muted
of?
me and
when
then
do we get rid of
to say that I don't
CPD?
care about my students? Do not appreciate that.
I don't care. I don't appreciate you saying that the BAM program has not worked for young African
It
American.
does not replace a full-time professionally trained social worker or psychologist.
It's worked very well in Edgewater, and I think it's had a very positive impact on the lives of people. And Mary, the programs are there because I fought to get them there in our community. It's had a very significant.
That's great. I want
impact.
that fight for professionally trained mental health professionals.
To answer your question about CPD, I think that Chicago Public Schools and the police department and elected officials and all stakeholders, including principals, have to work on a plan this school year to get police out of the schools by a year from fall. And I think trying to make sure that we're able to hire social workers, and as you are aware, that doesn't happen overnight, having them trained to work in schools, to me, is a thoughtful way to do that. Trying to have that money be used in a positive, constructive way to support students is something that I would be supportive of. So it's not something that's going to be done overnight.
So what are you going to do to make it happen?
It's going to be done, I think the responsible way to do it is over the course of a school year.
So what does that look like? Flesh that out. We are at your mercy in the schools. We beg
Actually,
you guys.
not, Mary, because I'm an alderman, and I think that there's a board of ed, and the board of education is going to vote on that contract.
So is there not also an ordinance being put
voice
forth
my
by
opinion.
Carlos Rosa
I'm going to voice my opinion.
Achieve this
I'm going to
in
voice
city
my
council?
opinion as the vice chairman of the Public Safety Committee and as a member of the Education Committee, as I did today, to try to come up with a plan so that the schools are safe, first and foremost, and they have supports in there for students. And in some schools, it may be different than others. I think that there are violence issues that go on around the city of Chicago, and it would not be responsible of us to not look at what those are in real issues. So I think part of this is to hear from principals and teachers and parents and students, specifically from across the city of Chicago, to make sure that we have a plan in place and not be irresponsible and pull people out without safety. And I think you should understand that. So that's something I'm committed to. And I think the reality in all of this stuff is that action's going to speak louder than words. And you'll see if I'm able to help push that
Amen.
issue forward or not. So I think I appreciate the question.
We see the fight. We see more as possible in city council. We see people like Carlos Rosa, Byron Sigcho Lopez, Rosanna fighting for these things in city council. We know more is possible. And I hope we can start seeing some of that from you, because our students cannot wait any longer. And these half measures and non-answers are just painful at this point.
So we are going to conclude it. We're at 8:07, and I know that we still have another 28 people raising your hand, which means that we're going to have another Zoom call in the future. I appreciate everybody being on the call tonight and the active back and forth and give and take. And I think, again, I have a very open mind about this stuff. I appreciate all of you sharing it with me. The conversation does not end tonight. It's going to continue through the course of the summer. I will keep you updated about the progress of the ordinances in City Council, and continue to welcome your feedback. So I wish all of you a happy and safe, more importantly, 4th of July. Appreciate all of you wearing your mask and socially distancing, and making sure that we still understand that we have COVID with us. But together we can work to make our city safer for all people, and specifically for communities in African-American men and women on the South and West Side and our youth. So I look forward to the work ahead, and thank you for being here tonight.